The contradiction is almost too clean. In a desert on the southern coast of Peru, archaeologists uncovered mummified dead, wrapped in extraordinary textiles, placed in ancient cemeteries by a culture we now call Paracas. And among them were skulls so elongated that even now they look like they belong in the wrong story. The setting is completely human. The burial tradition is completely human. The art, the ritual, the chronology, all of it fits inside the known world. And yet the skulls do not feel known. They feel like an interruption, a shape that should not be there, but is. For more than a century, the standard explanation has been straightforward. The Paracas were part of a broader ancient tradition of artificial cranial deformation, a practice found in many societies, where an infant's head was bound during the early years of life while the skull was still pliable. It was not pathology. It was not evidence of a separate species. It was culture, written onto bone. In Peru, as in other parts of the world, this kind of shaping could signal identity status, ancestry belonging. Science has no difficulty with that part of the story. The mechanism is real. The anatomy is real. The human skull can be permanently reshaped by sustained pressure in infancy, and the archaeological record is filled with examples. But the explanation only settles the first question, why the skulls are long. It does not settle the second why these particular skulls kept pulling the case back open. Why did they become magnets for claims about lost lineages, forgotten migrations, even non-human ancestry? Why did a funerary custom from ancient Peru turn into a modern genetic argument? That is where the mystery changes shape. Because once the skulls left the cemetery and entered the internet, the debate was no longer about ritual. It was about origin, about whether appearance can deceive, or whether bone remembers something older than history. And eventually that argument would move out of speculation and into forensic testing, where the question stopped being what these skulls looked like and became much more dangerous for every theory built around them. What exactly did their DNA say? At first, the case seems almost disappointingly ordinary. In the 1920s, the Peruvian archaeologist Julio Citello uncovered hundreds of Paracas mummy bundles on Peru's southern coast, their bodies preserved by desert dryness and wrapped in textiles so elaborate they changed what the world knew about ancient Andean society. Inside that unmistakably human setting were the elongated skulls. And anthropology had an answer: ready intentional cranial modification. The practice is well documented across the Andes and across the world. A child's head is shaped gradually in infancy, and the result can look dramatic centuries later. On paper that should have ended the mystery, but it did not. Even recent archaeological work notes that Paracas skulls have continued to fuel parascientific debate, in part because of their unusually high elongated form, and in part because the collection itself has long been difficult for researchers to access directly. That is where the surface explanation began to fail, not scientifically, but psychologically. Because ritual head shaping explains the method, yet it does not quiet the feeling these skulls create when you see them. The human mind does not like a familiar species wearing an unfamiliar silhouette. It wants a cleaner category, either completely normal or completely other. Completely quantum. The Paracas skulls refused both. They were human enough to stay inside archaeology, but strange enough to keep slipping into myth. And once that happened, the mystery no longer belonged to museums. It belonged to a modern audience, trained to distrust official answers and to treat every visual anomaly as suppressed evidence. The gap between what scholars considered settled and what the public found convincing became the real engine of the story. Then came genetics, and the case became volatile. Around 2014, preliminary mitochondrial DNA claims were circulated and promoted as evidence that at least one Paracas skull carried mutations unlike anything known in humans or other animals. That language was enough to transform an archaeological debate into a biological one. But mitochondrial DNA is only one line of inheritance passed through the mother, and ancient human DNA. Research has long been haunted by a central problem: contamination from present-day human DNA can distort results if authentication standards are weak or handling history is unclear. So now the story split in two directions at once. Bone morphology pointed toward a known cultural practice. Sensational genetic claims pointed toward exception. And for a while, neither side fully closed the door. The skulls remained in that dangerous place where uncertainty and imagination begin to cooperate. This is why the Paracas story lasted. Not because the evidence was strongest there, but because the ambiguity was. A shape altered by culture had been mistaken for a species-level mystery. A partial genetic claim had been treated like a verdict. And buried underneath both was a harder question that still had not been answered properly. Not what these skulls looked like, but whether a modern forensic standard, something stricter, colder, less romantic, would classify them as anything other than human. That is the point where the story finally leaves speculation behind. And that is where it becomes more interesting, not less. By this point, three explanations were competing for the same set of bones. The first was the oldest and still the most conservative. These were ordinary ancient humans whose heads had been deliberately shaped in infancy, nothing more than culture pressing itself into anatomy. The second was more seductive, that at least some of the Paracas individuals belonged to an unusual lineage, perhaps carrying ancestry from migrations, not yet fully understood, perhaps even preserving a biological difference that archaeology had missed. And the third theory was quieter, but in some ways more devastating than either of the others, that the strangest claims were not evidence of a hidden species at all, but the predictable result of looking at spectacular skulls through weak genetic testing fragmented samples, and a modern appetite for forbidden history. All three sounded plausible for a reason. Artificial cranial deformation is real and documented. Ancient DNA is fragile and easily contaminated. And the moment a human skeleton looks visually unfamiliar, the public begins to treat appearance as proof. The Paracas skulls were standing precisely at that intersection where science, uncertainty, and desire all start pulling in different directions. Then, in 2022, the case was forced into a narrower room. A study titled Raman Spectroscopy and STR Analysis of the Elongated Skulls from the Paracas Mummies of Peru examined tissue and hair, taken from Paracas specimens using a combination of comparative hair microscopy, Raman spectroscopy, and short tandem repeat analysis, STR typing, the same basic class of forensic DNA profiling used in criminal laboratories to identify human individuals from biological traces. That matters because STRs are not the vague outer edge of genetics. They are one of the core tools of modern forensic identification. The researchers reported that the hair characteristics matched human hair, that the STR allelic profiles were similar to and consistent with profiles observed in modern human populations, and that they saw no foreign DNA and no unusual pattern suggesting an unknown hominid or anything non-human. In other words, the evidence did not drift toward mystery. It collapsed toward humanity. The very test people expected to break the case open instead, closed the oldest door in it. But this is where the story becomes more interesting, not less. Because once DNA removes the fantasy of a separate species, the real question changes. If these skulls were human all along, why were so many people ready, almost eager to believe otherwise? Why did a cultural practice become a biological myth? And what does that say about the way we read the past, not as it was, but as we need it to be? Here is the twist. The 2022 result did not prove the old mystery right. It proved that the category of the mystery had been wrong from the beginning. STR analysis is built for a hard, forensic question, whether biological material carries the kind of profile expected from human individuals, and the National Institute of Justice describes it as the most common form of DNA profiling used in forensic work. In the Paracas study, The sampled tissue produced allelic patterns, the authors said, were similar to those seen in modern human populations, while the hair comparisons and Raman spectroscopy also matched human characteristics. No foreign DNA pattern appeared. No unknown hominid signature appeared. The dramatic shape remained, but the biological exception vanished. And that is why the case becomes deeper at the exact moment it seems to close. Because once the idea of a non-human lineage falls away, the real mechanism finally comes into focus. Artificial cranial deformation is not a fringe explanation improvised to protect orthodoxy. It is a documented human practice across Andean populations and elsewhere capable of radically altering the outline of the skull while leaving the individual fully human. At the same time, ancient DNA research has always carried a second warning label. Degraded samples are vulnerable to contamination from excavation, storage, handling, and laboratory work, unless strict controls are in place. Put those two facts together, and a clearer story emerges. A culturally modified skull enters the modern world looking biologically impossible. A fragment of uncertain genetic evidence is amplified before it is fully anchored, and the public, already primed to search the past for forbidden species and buried civilizations, mistakes visual shock for evolutionary distance. Imagine standing in front of one of those skulls for the first time. Even knowing the anthropology, you would still feel the pull. Your eyes would tell you that something is wrong. That is the human weakness at the center of the story. We trust appearance long before we trust method. We trust silhouette before sequence. But the deeper revelation of Paracas is not that DNA uncovered a hidden species. It is that DNA forced us to confront how easily culture can be mistaken for biology, and how quickly mystery grows when an ancient human practice survives in a form the modern mind no longer recognizes. The skulls did not expose a non-human past. They exposed a very human habit. When history looks unfamiliar, we call it impossible. So the ending is not that the mystery disappeared. It is that the mystery moved. The Paracas skulls still matter. They still disturb the eye. They still force a second look. But the most important question in the case is no longer whether they were human. On that point, the modern evidence is unexpectedly plain. Artificial cranial deformation is a documented human practice. STR profiling is one of the standard tools of forensic DNA identification. And when those tools were applied to Paracas samples in the 2022 study, the result pointed back to modern human populations, not away from them. The skulls were never evidence of a hidden species. They were evidence of how far human culture can reshape the body without changing the species beneath it. That is the part that stays with me, because it is tempting to think that truth becomes less interesting once it becomes human. But here, the opposite happens. Imagine a mother in ancient Peru binding an infant's head, not to create a monster, not to imitate something from the sky, but to place that child inside a system of identity, status, beauty, ancestry, belonging. Imagine centuries passing. The ritual is forgotten. The meaning is stripped away. The skull remains. And now the modern world stares at the result and calls it alien. In that reversal, something uncomfortable is exposed. We are often better at inventing the impossible than recovering the human context we lost. And maybe that is why stories like this endure. Not because the evidence supports the wildest conclusion, but because the unfamiliar has a strange authority over us. A shape that breaks expectation feels like a revelation. A partial genetic rumor feels more dramatic than a complete forensic answer. We say we want science to solve the mystery, but often what we really want is for the mystery to survive science. The Paracas skulls deny us that comfort. DNA does not give them back to myth. It gives them back to history. So in the end, this is not a story about aliens hiding in the archaeological record. It is a story about something quieter, and in some ways, more profound. Human beings have always altered themselves to express power, Memory, class, belief, and belonging. We mark the body. We inherit symbols. We mistake ritual for biology when the ritual becomes too old to recognize. The Paracas skulls matter because they remind us that the past does not become false when it becomes human. It becomes harder. Harder because it asks us to accept that ordinary people, through culture alone, can create forms that later ages will mistake for another world. And that may be the deepest revelation here. Sometimes the strangest thing in history is not that it is non-human. It is that it was us all along.